It's our pleasure to welcome Mark Nix back to the show. He's president of the National Right to Work Committee and the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. He got his Bachelor of Arts in Finance from James Madison University. And he's been president of the committee and foundation since 2003. And what they do is they provide unparalleled free legal assistance to workers and protect workers from abuses of compulsory unionism. Mark, welcome back to the show and Merry Christmas.
Andy, good to be on with you again, and back to you on the Merry Christmas thing. We're close. We're getting close.
We're getting real close. So, California is the epicenter in many ways, at least in part of the supply chain breakage and backup, that 40% of all U.S. container imports come through Long Beach and Los Angeles. And the press here, in my opinion, because they are, want to do a favor to Gavin Newsom and the unions, are not really explaining why this is happening, what's going on, and how to resolve it.
Yeah, Andy, the issue, it seems like when we talk about issues and problems, in the country, and particularly when we talk about the supply chain and tax policy and governmental policy, and it sounds like your guests are going to be all over this later in your show, but right now there's two reasons why there's problems in the supply chain, and they won't surprise you, Andy, but they may surprise others, and that is government and the union monopoly power that exists in the supply chain structure. These are legacy problems, unfortunately. They're not problems that are a result of the so-called economic surge that comes from COVID. There's something to that we're importing more because things slowed down so dramatically during the COVID crisis, and now people have got money and inflation and government's pumping money into the system. But when you talk about government, you know better than I that the regulations that were passed in Sacramento have caused a big problem at the ports, and that is because of the truckers. The so-called emission regulations that were passed, the AB5 legislation that was passed, and that, is trying to be rolled out across the country now, has had a devastating impact on the ports as it relates to the truck drivers and the independent contractors versus the employees. And I find it interesting, Andy, that the Department of Labor announced, a week and a half ago, that they were going to go to the ports and they were the Teamsters had convinced the Department of Labor to go in for look at misclassifications as the ports, i.e. independent contractors versus employees. And Andy, you know this as well as anyone, that independent contractors can't be unionized, but employees can. So you do the math.
Well, that goes back to AB5, and most of the reporters don't know about the diesel engine rule, and they don't know about AB5. And folks, as a background, California forced every truck driver, construction company, and farming company to replace diesel engine powered equipment. So, big earth movers in a construction company, tractors and trucks to haul produce, for instance, farming company, and then plus every long haul truck. All of them were supposed to replace their engine twice, even though their engine was perfectly well and could operate in the other 49 states with no problem. And California said, no, we don't want that truck operating here. Got to replace it right now, and then they're supposed to replace it again with an engine that has not been invented yet. So if you were wanting to become a truck driver, would you buy a truck knowing you got to replace the engine?
Yeah, if you were a truck driver, would you want to do business in California, and would you want to try to service the two ports that provide 40% of all the imports to the United States economy? I mean, there's a trucker shortage, and that it's government and union power that basically caused that. And you're exactly right. I mean, how do you replace a motor with a motor that hasn't been invented yet? Only in California, Andy.
Right. And then the other issue is AB5. So AB5 basically says it basically got rid of contractors in the state of California. Now, the truckers sued so that it hasn't applied to them. But once again, why would you invest in a truck if you're an independent? You're an owner-operator is another way of explaining it. Owner-operator, you take the gigs that you want. You take the jobs that you want. Well, if they know that they're not going to be allowed to work in California, if AB5, if that court case, comes down in the state's favor, again, folks, investment requires some assurance of return. And if they think it's up in the air as to whether they can work and or whether their equipment's going to be rendered worthless, that's why you have a shortage.
Yeah, and Andy, that case it has not been yet scheduled for argument at the United States Supreme Court, but it's the California Trucking Association case, and that is pending. They haven't argued the case yet. I think they've asked for additional briefings on the case if I'm familiar with the status of it. But right, if you're an investor or a truck driver, owner operator, or a married couple that wants to buy a truck and go into that business, I mean, the uncertainty of what could happen in the legal system would definitely make you think twice about that, and that is causing some of the problems at the ports. And again, the reason for AB5, it's pretty clear, and maybe the media is not reporting about it, but I'm sure you have, that was a direct payoff to organized labor.
Yes.
And when we thought about it, back at AB5, you were talking about Uber and Lyft drivers that had replaced the monopoly taxi system. And the unions wanted a piece of that action because they couldn't unionize independent contractors, the drivers of Uber and Lyft. But the impact of it, Andy, and I know you and I have talked about this, the impact ended up being most dramatic for the kind of the liberal internet platforms out there. A lot of gig workers and journalists who were writing, copy and pieces for internet platforms were put out of business because the platform said, look, we enjoy having a couple of pieces a month from you, but we can't employ you as an employee, and so sorry, you're out of work. And now I know that, they put something on the ballot in 2020 that actually reformed AB5, but even that got stood up by your Supreme Court, if I'm following the story correctly.
Well, plus the ballot proposition only dealt with Uber and Lyft. It left everybody else hanging out there. So, folks, there's some jobs, and like I said, an owner-operator of a tractor-trailer rig, is a truck driver is one. But think of a musician. How many organizations hire a full-time musician to work full-time versus, hey, we're going to, let's say they're in a band. We're going to play in this place this weekend, and then following weekend we're playing in L.A., and the following weekend we're playing in Oakland, and et cetera, et cetera. They have a different employer every week because they play once and they move on. Or a photojournalist. I remember a guy was taking my pictures or stuff and said he was going to get laid off because he works occasionally for a newspaper. They don't need a full-time or at least a second full-time photographer. There was doctors and nurses that worked in rural hospitals. They just came in, once a month. They may have worked a weekend or a week out of a month. All of those people lost their jobs, and the employers lost their contractors.
Yeah, and the key reason behind all of that push in AB5 was the idea that they wanted to unionize these employees in California. And, that language, the original AB5 language, Andy, it won't surprise you, has made its way back here to Washington, D.C., and it's included in the so-called PRO Act, which is a huge bill that would empower union officials over employees across the country. And it would start by repealing the 27 right-to-work laws that are currently in place in 27 states in America.
And this is, again, and originally this was so embarrassing, Mark, and I know you know this, that folks originally, they literally photocopied or cut and paste the language of AB5 and put it in a bill back there. They were too lazy to type it out. They literally cut and paste it straight out of California law, which caused havoc out here, including, like he said, in the Bay Area. Bay Area uses a lot of gig employees. They have a specialty, and they work for a project, maybe a day, a week, a month, or 6 months, or maybe even a year, but they have multiple clients. It's like, dentists or should a dentist be your employee? Anyway, we're going to take a break. Mark Nix is our guest. You're listening to the Andy Caldwell Show. Stay tuned.
You are listening to the Andy Caldwell Show, the only talk show that covers the entire Central Coast, our state, and nation.
I'd like to welcome you back to the show. Our guest, Mark Nix, President of National Right to Work Committee and National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Mark, one of the questions I have for you before we've been talking about for folks the supply chain breakage and the backlog at the ports of LA and Los Angeles, which bring in 40% of all containers coming into the United States come into those two ports. I am under the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong because this is anecdotal, I'm under the impression that supply chain breakage seems to be hitting retailers worse on the East Coast. Is that because the stuff comes into California first, that we don't send it to the East Coast to be redistributed here?
Well, Andy, I think the reason for that is that it has to get in. It comes from, obviously Asia and China. It comes from that direction, so it comes across the Pacific. And to bring one of those big container ships through the Panama Canal, as I understand it, cost about $3,000 per container to get it around into the Gulf of Mexico or up on the East Coast, the ports there. However, it looks like some of the shippers are starting to bring product across and bring it across the Atlantic because there is a growing backlog in the ports in Georgia and New York and Philadelphia where there are ships sitting out in sea. Now, it's not quite like Los Angeles and Long Beach, where I think now there's not been a week where there's been under 100 ships waiting. What they did, Andy, was just pushed out the barrier, and they keep the ships moving and keep them farther out so they can't be, photographed by a drone and be counted. So as long as they're continuing to move, they don't count them as anchored. And as long as they're farther out in the Pacific, they're not anchored. So they're trying to keep the counts. That's how the politicians are saying, well, things are getting better. The White House said they were going to get these ports open 24/7, and they were going to work with retailers. Well, what the retailers have done, the biggest ones, unfortunately, and this hurts the smaller retailers, is the biggest retailers have basically commissioned their own ships. So they're only carrying the material that the big retailers like Target and Walmart need, and they're bringing in the ports where there's not a backlog. But for mom and pop retailer on Main Street, that's a real problem. And if we have to ship it across the country, guess what? Those increased costs just get passed along, and that's kind of the inflation story as well that's beginning to become very aware to moms and pops and folks that are shopping for Christmas or buying groceries for their family.
Well, here on the Central Coast, Mark, we provide a ginormous chunk of the nation's strawberries and vegetables, and in the San Joaquin Valley even more so. And the truckers are getting killed. I mean, the farmers are getting killed to get that stuff delivered to the distribution centers. Folks, let me give you another example of the inflation that he's talking about. There was a story about a retailer. They make gaming devices. A little over a year ago, he was complaining that it cost about $2,800 to ship one container from China to his warehouse. It went up from $2,800 to $3,500. Now it's $18,000. It went from $2,800 a little over a year ago to $18,000 per container. And this,
I'm sure the retailer is not passing along those costs. He's absorbing those costs, right?
They can't. They can't. This is, right. Again, too many people are functionally, economically illiterate. Folks, businesses can't pay these costs because their profit margin, in most businesses, it's 3 to 5%. They have to pass these costs on to consumers or they go out of business. They can't afford payroll. They can't afford to buy stuff, to make things, because they can't absorb these costs. That's why your food prices are going up. I used to buy on holidays sometimes a pretty good-sized chunk of ribeye, 15-pound ribeye or something like that. It used to be $100 and something. Now it's $200 and something bucks. The price went from $8, $9, $10 to almost $14 a pound. And the same is all across. And so people are getting squeezed. Now, the bad news is this isn't going to get any better because as you've reported and others, those 15,000 West Coast port workers, their contract's going to expire this coming summer.
Yeah, Andy, and that doesn't bode well. If history is any indication of how that's worked in the past, what we'll see is slowdowns, and we'll begin to see pressure building on the Pacific Maritime Association, which represents the ports and the shippers. The pressure will just grow on them to basically agree to whatever the unions demand, because otherwise, as we saw in 2002, and we saw, well, I didn't see it in 1971. I was alive then, but I didn't notice it. Maybe I did. I don't know if I didn't get to my pajamas or what. But in 1971, there was a 130-day strike on the West Coast. I mean, in 2002, it was a slowdown. And right now, you're seeing some inefficiencies beginning to make themselves known because they're in the process of negotiating the new contract. And those type of labor relations, when you have a monopoly and you can shut things down or control things or slow things down, that usually puts pressure on the system. And when that pressure gets put on the system, the cost rises, and, here we go, more inflation in the system.
Well, then there's the other thing, and I'm sure California and the Biden administration had a hand in this. Folks, here on the Central Coast, we have clean air, which is we don't have enough industry, we don't have enough cars to generate much of any pollution. So our pollution comes from people passing through on the freeway, but it also comes from offshore shipping, these ships that are going to L.A. and Long Beach. Why? Because they don't burn the cleanest, most expensive fuel they can find. They typically burn the cheapest fuel they can find. And so they've been after them for a long, long time. But now these ships are being asked to reduce their carbon footprints. First of all, I don't even know if the better fuel's available in that amount of that quantity, but the price is going to go up if they have to start burning different kind of fuel.
Yeah, and the other way to solve that emission problem is to slow down. Don't go as fast. Don't run the motors as fast.
Yes.
Keep the RPMs down, and that slows the delivery time as well. So again, government is one of the factors in all of this, and we find out that things generally do not get better the more government gets involved, and that's what's happening here.
Well, I want to thank you for bringing these stories to us. And again, like you said, what they've done is they're playing tricks to hide the problem. They don't solve the problem. They obfuscate it and or obscure it, and that's what's going on right now still to this day.
Yeah. Well, Eddie, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you about these issues. And I know you've got expertise out there, and frankly, unfortunately for Californians, you see it first and you see it worst most times. And, boy, it's starting to work its way across the country like so many of the bad policies that have been initiated out there on the West Coast, making their way across. And we just got to keep people informed and keep them aware of what the impact this is on their daily lives and then the impact on the future of the country for sure.